Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Circle of Fellows episode for June 2023. I'm Shel Holtz. I will be your host for this episode. I am joined today by Martha Muzichka, representing the selection committee for the IABC Fellows class of 2023. If you're here because you saw the promotion for this episode, you saw Neil Griffiths was going to be here. He chaired that committee. He ended up having a scheduling conflict, but we're delighted that Martha's able to step in because she will also be the chair of the committee for the 2024 selection effort. Glad to see you here, Martha.
Thank you very much, Shel. It's a pleasure, as always.
And also with us, exactly as you should be expecting, are the two new fellows for 2023, Ginger Homan and Russell Grossman. Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you.
And this is an annual program that we have just started last year, having the new fellows on an episode of Circle of Fellows. So rather than address a specific topic, what we're going to do is just have sort of a wide-ranging, freewheeling conversation. And for those of you who are watching live, we invite you to participate in this conversation. There is a chat function on YouTube Live, and all you have to do is enter your question, your comment, your observation, and I am able to share it on the screen, and we'll be able to get feedback from the members of the panel today. But Ginger, let's start with you. Can you share your background? Give us a quick overview of what your career path has been and how you ended up here today.
Absolutely, would love to. But first, let me just say, because I'm getting some hesitation in the video, I'm actually coming from Tulsa, Oklahoma. We got hit by a massive storm over the weekend. 100-mile-per-hour winds came sweeping through. And so I actually have no power in my home or my office. So I've found a spot on the other side of town that does have power, but things are still a little tricky in these parts. But on my career, I have spent a significant amount of time on internal and external comms because I felt like I needed to learn both. So when I was with a petroleum company early in my career, I had an incredible mentor that really helped me focus on change communications. And that became my path that's common through both, because once I left there, I was vice president of marketing at an architecture engineering company. But what I found was that the core of change communications really works if you're trying to align employees or if you're trying to broaden market share, that it's all about changing a behavior. And in 2009, stepped out to create my own company. And I've been doing that ever since. Zia Communications. It's usually 60-40 on internal or external comms. More internal, and marketing is always there as a bread and butter. So.
Great. Well, thank you. And Russell, how about a quick overview of your career path?
Well, I think like many people who have entered communications, I did so by accident. It was never my intention when I left university to do communications. In fact, my first degree was in management and chemical sciences. But I just ended up on a graduate scheme, and I ended up in a place which was called something like the press office. What was it, etc. And I thought, oh, this is quite interesting, and it was a kind of slippery slope from there, really. And over a 40 years on the 3rd of October this coming year, I've done actually every part of communications other than advertising, and none of that has really been planned. It's been serendipitous. But then I would always say that your path through your career is usually the result of two things. One is capability, which is down to you, and one is serendipity, which is absolutely down to other things. And I've just been fortunate that those two things have coincided. I've been at junctures where people have rung me up or suggested things, and that's how I've ended up where I've ended up today. So I think, as I say, you can do the best you can, but then it's up to someone else as well to make sure that you follow that through.
And where are you today?
So I'm currently the Director of Communications at the UK Rail Regulator. I love trains, always have them. I've been there for 7 years. I've done a career in government communications for the last 15 years. I'm a senior director in an organization called the Government Communications Service, where we've got some 7,000 practitioners. And within that context, I'm the head of profession for internal communications, have been since 2014. And we've got about 1,200 practitioners within that bailiwick that look after internal communications.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that both Russell and Ginger have served as chair of the IABC International Executive Board. But Martha, can you take just a couple of minutes and talk about the selection committee process? What goes into identifying the new fellows each year?
Well, the committee is made up of different representatives, and including fellows as well as members at large from IABC, with support from staff. I've been on the committee for 2 years now, and it's been a really great experience. The process for us generally starts with the committee coming together and reviewing the application guide and developing communications to inform members of the call for nominations. We provide 6 to 8 weeks for nominations to be submitted, and then we undergo a process of review. We identify questions that we'd like to ask candidates for interview. Given the different time zones we all represent, and perhaps based on the number of candidates we need to interview, we develop a process around managing the time zones and covering off how we can all participate or review the interviews. And we do have a rubric, a set of standards, much like Gold Quill and other awards, to identify what are the benchmarks or the attributes of fellows. And we have, I would say, lively and enriching discussions, because we want to think about what a fellow will bring to the organization. What does it mean to be a fellow? What are the attributes and characteristics, aspects of things that you've done in your career that lead you to be a leader in communications? And then we make recommendations to the International Executive Board, who then confirm the recommendations. And then we proceed to planning the celebration, welcome, and induction of fellows in at the June World Conference, which will be in Chicago next year. So it's not quite a year-long process, but we do put a lot of thought into it, and we think about what does it mean, as I said, to be a fellow, and how also then fellows going forward can continue to contribute, shape, mentor, guide, inform, and lead communications through the future.
So it's not a Lifetime Achievement Award, as I'm sure Russell and Ginger would be happy to hear. I don't think anybody on this panel today is at the end of their career, still gainfully employed, either independently or with an organization. So it's really a recognition of contributions made to this point.
Absolutely, Shel. We have 5 areas that we consider, looking at the values and ethics of IABC and how the prospective fellow best represents that. We also look at contributions to knowledge in terms of presentations, papers, workshops, writing, and so on. We look at the contributions that a person has made to the organization at all the levels that are possible. Members can participate locally in their chapters, regionally, as well as internationally with various committees in the IEB. And we also look at what the person has achieved in their work in communications and how they have innovated and promoted excellence in communications. So we look for well-rounded individuals who the sum of their accomplishments lead them to be considered as fellows for the IABC.
Great. So for next year, if those of you watching or listening know somebody you think would be deserving of this designation, please take the time to put together a nomination. But let me ask Russell, you first, and then I'll pass it to Ginger. But let's have a conversation about these. What is exciting you most right now about communication in general? What's on your radar as being exciting?
So I think the most exciting thing about communications for me is the way in which it can shape the society that we live in. We think about the way that communications itself is governed by that, but equally we have that role, and you can see that. For example, just at this moment in time, we have Pride Month, and I've just come back from Toronto, but also here in London, you see a lot of communications geared towards that. I know some people will say some of it is pride washing and the like, but we have a role, I think, to shape the way society goes, and that's a huge responsibility. In fact, it's not, when we talk about communications leadership, that is one of the things that we need to understand, and the value there, for example, of ethics and the way in which things like disinformation are important, and that we understand the tools and techniques to ensure that disinformation is minimized, all of those things. So for me, I think that's exciting. At a more micro level, I do get a bit of a kick out of, we'll do a campaign and we'll see it in the media, and with a bit of luck, it will be positive for the organization that I'm representing. I'm pleased to say that pretty much mostly it is. And then the third thing I'll just mention is that something I personally, and particularly now in my approaching my 5th decade at work, is the ability as a communications leader to give something back. And particularly, I take excitement, if you like, certainly pleasure, in seeing how people that I've worked with over a period of time have progressed in their own career, and in some cases how I can continue to help them. The fact that they may not work for me precisely at this moment in time is not that significant. The value of social media means that you can track people throughout their career, and I get a lot of satisfaction from knowing that sometime way back, or perhaps not so way back, I've been responsible in some small way to put them on that path to a successful career in communications.
Yeah, I think mentorship is really important. Through the San Francisco chapter, I was paired with a young communicator, and we've been talking monthly for about 1.5 years now. You can look to IABC for those kinds of programs. But you talked about disinformation, Russell, and you work for a government agency or a quasi-governmental agency. How are you dealing with misinformation and disinformation, and are you using any new tools to combat?
It's actually a government department that I work for, and disinformation and misinformation is a key subject that we worry about in government, and more broadly in the government communications service. We have an approach, I think you'd regard it in terms of tools, which is called Resist. Some of the materials within that are probably not for great disclosure, but what I can tell you is that it is a subject that I think all government practitioners, and certainly not just in the UK, are alive to. There is, of course, a difference between misinformation, which is genuinely wrongly construed information, and disinformation, which is quite a deliberate attempt to warp the truth for purposes that we wouldn't condone. But it is certainly something that's quite front of mind for us. And if you like, as a technique, we would always ask, I'm talking generically now, we would always ask, is this information correct? Is the evidence that's provided this information from suitable sources? And if not, what is it that we ought to be concerned about?
Ginger, I don't know if you have government clients, but among your client base, is anybody worried about disinformation? Are you working on that at all?
Yeah, we are. I mean, I think the battle for truth will be one of the things that really changes us as an organization, as a profession. And we're struggling with how to do that. The narrative for the disinformation is usually very well told, and it pulls people in. It's compelling. So truth be, more compelling? How do we use storytelling to our advantage? We have the skills, we just don't always pull them out for what might be considered mundane because we think we have the facts on our side. But I think with AI, it gets harder and harder to tell what is true and what's not true for the general public. And so I think that's a huge challenge. Here in the States, we're even coming up against some states are passing laws to no longer do business with organizations, financial organizations, or other companies that look at climate change or gun violence as risk factors in making decisions on who they do business with or other ESG metrics. And so if you've got states with laws against that, as a communicator inside an organization that wants to promote is going to be a tough one. And we're going to have to get our strategies together because the next 5 to 7 years are going to be critical.
Yeah, you're talking about the laws that have been passed in several states. I find that a fascinating trend, especially given the fact that ESG-focused funds are outperforming other funds. So it's an ideological position that is, at least on its surface, anti-business.
It is, which is completely different from what that political party claims to be. It's always been a pro-business party. In my own state, a recent law that was passed that does just that is going to cost the employees of the state over $9 million in their retirement fund because they disqualified a couple of institutions. And how to have that battle and how much a state is willing to spend, to be perceived on a particular side of political thought.
Share a comment or a question from a viewer. This is Mirko Petrocevic, who was, by the way, at the conference in Toronto. He has a question for Russell. How do you respond to misinformation or disinformation about your department staff or leaders spread by critics via social media?
Well, I'm pleased to say that we don't get much of that on social media. Certainly not disinformation, but on the misinformation side, we do seek to correct that wherever possible, without making too much of a fuss about it, depending on what the issue is. Sometimes it's really simple. I work for an organization, I said it's a rail regulator for shorthand. It's actually called the Office of Rail and Road, and we often get called the Office of Road and Rail. It's a simple thing. We do correct that with journalists and the like wherever possible, just to make sure that that's the case. If it's something that is an issue of factual record that is incorrect, then we will rebut that. Sometimes we would do that on social media. Sometimes if it is particularly significant, to be honest, I don't really have many examples that I can think of where that has been the case. But if that is the case, then we might even put out a release, or if it's for our staff, where we have more connection, obviously, with people on a regular basis. We might do that on as part of a regular dialogue on a town hall. We've actually had one of our town halls today in our organization. One of the benefits from COVID actually is that the reach of town halls has been much greater because we've stayed online. We used to have people in a room, and a few people would turn up, but many people that were in the organization weren't there. Now we get a much greater following, if you like, online, and it allows us to reach many more people. And in the context of that sort of a channel, we use Slido, and we regularly encourage people to give us questions that they believe have issues with them, And many of those issues actually are misinformation that they've heard, rumors, half-truths, etc. And we're able to deal with those in a very direct way, in a very authentic way. I have a chief executive that is innately excellent at being a communicator. If he is watching this, I don't get paid to say that, but we are able to kind of deal with that directly and authentically in a way perhaps that we had less opportunity to do before COVID.
Just to follow up, Mirko says, so you don't get personal attacks? If not, I'm happy to hear that.
No, we don't get personal attacks.
Okay. Ginger, do you want to respond to that as well? The question about any attacks aimed at the departments or staff of your clients? Does that come up?
On occasion it does. And we mostly respond with just stating facts and then providing links to the said facts. If it's a personal attack, just somebody just being mean, then it just depends on what the comment. A lot of times we don't respond to that if it was just a personal attack. But just always trying to lean back into the narrative to create a bridge to get back to the story that we do want to tell, the one that we do want to share.
Martha, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, it's always a challenge because with social media in particular, personal attacks can be quite severe and distressing. And I've worked with people who work in political positions, and it can be very, very challenging. And, most will support taking the high road and providing the information that supports their position, and not getting into personality clashes or verbal abuse or information abuse on social platforms. But I find that what's challenging for people is trying to differentiate things that are true and things that appear to be true. And so for people who really want to know, if you provide them with the information that says, no, this person is upstanding, they're doing their best, etc., then they will, accept that and engage in a respectful fashion. You can disagree with people and still have a good conversation to try and tease out why you may have that disagreement. In other cases, it's probably not worth the energy. And what you need to do is sort of step back and say, okay, well, what's happening here that may lead people to assume that this information is correct? So, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other sometimes, and you got to pick the battle that you want to take on that day. One of the things that I am always intrigued by, because sometimes we think of those bad days as something that might change how we think about something. But I am curious to hear from Ginger and Russell, what's something that has happened in your career that really made you say, wow, I'm going to look at communications in a different way, or I'm going to try this new approach because I think it's going to lead to successful an exchange of information or a change in attitude. What's something that really made your day in your communications career?
Russell, I hear that inhale. Go ahead.
I think it's really important that people who are practitioners in communication, incidentally, I never call myself a communicator. And this is relevant to what I'm going to say. I never feel that I'm any better as an actual communicator than the people that I work with. So I always regard myself as a practitioner in communications. And I think in that context, particularly if we work with leaders in business who largely have got there because they are good communicators, you can learn quite a lot from them. And I actually call that good grace. It's where you recognize that somebody occasionally, sometimes perhaps more than occasionally, might have a better idea about communications than you do. And the good grace is not to say, oh, I think my idea is better, but to say, that's really interesting, write it down and use it somewhere else later. And I've done that a few times. I would particularly cite one person, not exclusively, but just that comes to mind. It's a guy called Greg Dyke, who was the Director General at the BBC when I was the head of internal communications at the BBC in the late 90s and the early noughties. And so he was, when I said Director General, he was basically the CEO. And what he innately knew about internal communications, or what he didn't know rather, wasn't worth knowing. He was innately an internal communicator. And at that point, that was my first role actually in internal communications. And I learned an enormous amount from him in terms of the way he responded, the way he thought, the way he acted. And has probably definitely shaped the approach that I've taken ever since to internal communications. I think the interesting thing about someone like Greg Dyke is that if you asked him to spout the theory of internal communications, he'd struggle. But if you asked him, how would you approach this, it would be innately correct. And I think I've taken on a number of occasions where I have been privileged to work with some really, really good CEOs, managing directors and leaders. And I've taken a bit from each of them. And I suppose the person that I am today is a meld of, yes, me, but also a number of their approaches, ideas, and the like, stuff that you don't necessarily read in a textbook, but is definitely worth listening to and repeating. And on that listening to, and I'll just finish on this point, remember that as communicators, if we are communicators, but certainly in practitioners in communication, half of what we do should be listening.
And I would even debate Russell on half of what we do. I think listening is probably the most important skill set that we have. But to go to your question, Martha, it was early in my career when I had one of those moments of, okay, this is why I'm here. I was leading a comms group, and the new city. So all those people were either going to be out of a job or looking at moving their families to a city that was a significant difference and significantly different than the one where we existed. And each morning I would come into the office and there would be a line of people waiting to talk to me because they knew I had access to the CEO's ear. And so they just wanted to share their story. And so for days, I just sat there and listened. And some of them would bring a letter in from their child on why their dad shouldn't move or why they wanted their mom's job to stay there here in Tulsa, as a matter of fact. So I clearly didn't make the move. And it was in that moment, even though I knew what we do as communicators was important to people and their families in creating that trust and alignment, it just really hit home with me how important what we do is and how much we can touch individuals' lives. And if we touch an employee, so I looked at everything through a different lens after going through that and have really tried to approach each job and each client with a sense of purpose on how I can make a difference for the better and how the team can really work towards accomplishing whatever that vision is. So that was profound, but also in the course of just working and doing our jobs, I think we have a unique role as an information broker within our organizations. We're one of the few employees that are in and out of different departments day in, day out. And we have an understanding of what's happening in different parts of the company, the way other leaders may not, because they're not jumping in and out. And we can drive those connections and bring people together and really create a different dimension of value for our organization by sharing that lens and bringing different leaders together. Oh, you're working on this? Well, somebody over in this other department did the same things. For everybody. So those were a couple of instances that I think oftentimes what we do, we may not be looking deep enough at the value we truly bring.
Well, let's stick with that internal communications theme. What do you think is the biggest misperception or misunderstanding about internal comms? And I'll tell you that for me, it's the notion that it's producing content. The consultation with senior leadership, for example, should be a big part of any communication effort. Just ensuring that in their day-to-day conversations, whether it's one-on-one with somebody or in a group meeting, that they're reinforcing the messages that they want to make sure everybody is hearing, and also that they are reflecting the behaviors that they are asking everybody else to exhibit. So what about you? Ginger, what do you think is the biggest misperception about internal comms?
Well, the tactics. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Everybody wants to know, what tactical thing. What are you going to put my announcement out? Is it going to go to all employees, even though it doesn't impact all employees? One of the things I did to help combat that early in my career, and this was my mentor's advice, not mine. So I was taking advice from the best mentor I'd had, who was not a comms professional, but was a natural communicator. Was to sit down with senior leaders once a year and talk about what they were wanting to accomplish and pull together a strategic plan to help them do that and show them throughout at the end, different milestones at the end of the year, what we had done to help them achieve their goals. And by approaching it from that perspective, it was easy to teach them that it's much more than the announcement or the thing. And how to really structure their communications inside out to drive action and to get those things done. For me, anyway, that's what I've encountered. What have you encountered, Russell?
So I'm 100% with Shel. We actually call it SOS, sending out stuff. And the idea that most people who have this passing interest only in internal communications think that that's what we do. In truth, and we've mentioned it already on this show, the value of the internal communications practitioner is to be able to waft through the entire building, both virtually. It's more difficult virtually, but nevertheless can be done, both virtually and physically. We have, as internal comms practitioners, the run of the building, the run of the C-suite. And that needs to be used. It's a responsibility as a counsellor. You will spell it with one L, I will spell it with two, but we'll both spell it, I think, with an S. I think so. But it's a responsibility that we have. And so the basic soft skills that internal comms practitioners need to exhibit are relationship ones and judgment ones and timing ones and insight ones. You'll notice I haven't mentioned grammar, spelling, or punctuation in any of these yet. Yes, writing is important, but certainly in the more senior roles, it is the ability to be able to judge when a principal, a senior person or whatever, either isn't doing the right thing and that needs discussing with them, or is doing the right thing but could do it even better. And the relationship between your director or head of internal communications and your CEO, or further down the tree, your internal communications manager and your relevant manager in the business is absolutely critical. Now, I think one of the reasons why a lot of this doesn't get out is because a lot of what I've just described goes on behind the scenes. It's not seen in quite the same way, for example, that a press release is seen or a stakeholder event is seen. It's necessarily something that is more discreet. And I think as a result of that, and it's not something that we shout about on a daily basis either. And I think that's why the value of internal communications is often hidden from people.
And Martha, I want to get... Oh, go ahead, Ginger.
Sorry. I was going to say, I also think part of the problem with not the true value not being seen is that as a profession, a lot of us still are not measuring our work. We talk a lot about measuring what matters, but I have found with groups that consistently measure the outcomes as opposed to the outputs, which is old hat, but still so many aren't doing it, that they're able to show that value to their companies and they are valued. So I think it goes to us sometimes too, to make sure that we're doing that measurement, the measurement of what did actually change because of what we did, or how employees were actually aligned. What was the difference that we made? And I think we have to consistently do that.
Yeah, I think it's a revelation to some internal communicators to hear that, you know, the job is to influence behaviors at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also build on that answer from Ginger? Excellent answer about the data and what measurement. To say that I think the other thing that I don't see enough of in internal communications is segmentation of the audience
Yes.
and insight into those individual person types, if you like. There's still too much of an assumption that all staff are equal, and of course all staff are not equal. In change, for example, what's their propensity to be either advocates or badvocates? In normal run, obviously, what is the expectation that you have of your middle managers to be the communicators? I think quite correctly, if it's working well, internal communications role is to help leaders be the communicators with their teams. And that requires insight into the different strata of managers and also, as I say, the different propensities they have for change or whatever. So I don't think there's enough of that takes place as well in the way that it would, for example, in some external relations disciplines.
I also think that an important role of the internal communicator is to facilitate horizontal communication. I've felt this way for a long time, but I currently work for a general contractor. We build big, iconic structures. And what I've learned is that every project is like its own little company. They're in their project trailer and they don't interact that much with people in the company who are not on the project. And they're innovating, they're learning, they're finding better ways to do things and not sharing it with everybody else in the organization who could benefit from it. So it's sort of, you know, ventilating those silos and making sure that that information can move horizontally. Is this something that you also see as a communication role?
I do. I think that goes back to when I was talking about we're in and out of those places and we see it happening. And I think we have to bring it out in the air and surface it. And I think that Russell makes a really great point. I see so many communicators still just lump, employees as their audience. So even when you're talking about breaking down those silos, you're talking about creating the right conversations between the right 2, 3, 5 people inside an organization that's really going to drive value. And I think it is absolutely our role to do that because we should be able to step back and connect the dots of what we see inside our organizations.
I'd like to repeat something that Kimberly Good said. Kimberly is the Chief Communications and Social Impact Officer at Bank of Montreal, and she was one of the excellent panel that was on the first one of the first days of the World Conference. I have to give a plug for World Conference here, incidentally. Again, not because I've been asked to, but because it was absolutely superb. Next year is in Chicago, and I thoroughly recommend it. And Kimberly said, actually, communications practitioners are dot connectors. And I think when I thought about that, I thought, absolutely, our responsibility or the greatest value that we bring, whether internal or external, in my view, is to be able to join the dots across an organization or across different functions doing different parts towards an overall endeavor, or indeed, if I extend that, to be able to create the patterns in the mess, particularly with many organizations in constant change. We know change is messy. The communications practitioner's role is to try and make sense of that for people, and that's all about, or a lot of that is about, horizontal communication, and recognizing that there are times when the management has got bored with the subject, but it hasn't even reached the vast majority of people that need to change their behavior or change their attitude or whatever it is that we're trying to achieve in change.
I think that's
Martha, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in too, but before we do, with about 20 minutes left, I wanted to invite anybody who has joined this broadcast, this stream, since we've started, that you can use that chat feature to pose a question or share a comment, and we invite you to do that. So, Martha?
Well, I think Russell's point about the horizontal communication is really critical because sometimes, people do get bored with an issue, but fail to understand that at different levels, depending on how your role is in an organization, you may have greater or lesser interest, but that can change. And I'm reminded of a project I worked on quite a number of years ago where there was a significant amount of change happening in terms of how the teams were going to be constructed, how they were going to be communicating with each other, what were the overlaps or what were the components, because we were looking at not just multidisciplinary teams, but interdisciplinary work as well. And, aside from producing content, we did have a little newsletter that people actually liked because it just gave that bird's eye view of what was happening. But management got tired of it. And so they wanted to, do town halls or something else. And, we came back because one of the things I like to do was pop from office to office, building to building to see what people were saying, to think about, the issues they were raising. And one of them was that they didn't feel included anymore in the link of communications that was happening about that particular project. And so, for me, it was a lesson that you can have multiple ways of sharing the information about the same topic, but you need to look at the different options, again, because you segment the audience, you understand what their needs are. Some people work in one building, some people may be out in the field, they don't have a little inbox with, paper, etc. So it's, to me, you need to think about how people want the information and not just what you want to send to them. And sometimes that message or that understanding isn't made clear at different levels of the organization because we have that need to tell our story, that sometimes we don't understand how our story may not necessarily click or resonate with the needs that the other people are bringing to us.
I can't go a Circle of Fellows panel without bringing technology into the conversation, at least a little. And Russell, in terms of this segmentation of the audience, technology has made this easier. There are tools now, several of the vendors who provide these tools were sponsors at the World Conference in Toronto, that allow you to create channels that can be managed by a member of a segmented audience that is really for them to exchange information with each other. It's not for chat. I mean, you have Teams and other tools for that, like Yammer. But this is really for sharing information and knowledge. I can't wait to bring one of these in here. I can just imagine using it for superintendents or project engineers who have this great need to share information but don't have that channel. Do you find that technology has made it easier to reach audience segments, or are there less modern methods for doing that work just as well?
The methods that we tend to use are is to encourage people to be in something called a room, which is a kind of physical space with four walls and a roof, and to meet on a regular basis. So if I think just, for example, of our senior leadership group, we encourage them to meet on a regular basis. We prefer them to be in a room. Sometimes they are online. I'm not sure that I am particularly familiar with the way in which specific tools can help with segmentation. I would certainly say that it is easier with technology to connect people, but ultimately it's the relationships between those people that are going to deliver the value. And I think technology is only a helpmeet on that. The most powerful interactions are always when people get together, and it is my observation that the more people can, even after COVID, be physically together, the more they will rub off each other. It's really difficult, I think, or it's more difficult. It's not impossible for people to connect online in the spontaneous space. You can kind of do this online thing, and it's 90% as good as being in the room when you've actually got the dialogue going. But it's the spontaneity that I think we have lost with people, no longer being in the office most of the time and all of that. I think that's an issue that we haven't yet cracked as communications practitioners, but it's one that we continue to need to work on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, we've started a quarterly meeting of our superintendents, and I think all that does is build those relationships to the point that they wish they could have a channel to continue those engagements between the quarterly meetings, since they're all, sort of isolated out on their projects. Ginger, what's your view on
Well,
this?
I do think the technology helps, but I think you can still segment it through some old-fashioned methods that every employee doesn't need this information. Convincing the person that you're trying to help that we really do need to segment the audience. And probably the best way I've been able to do that is go through and just say, okay, for this group of employees, what exactly do you want them to do different once they read this information? And we're able to see where, or they're able to finally come to realize that their audience is not everybody. Now, sometimes it is, but most of the time, I'd say 9 times out of 10, the audience is not everybody. And so we're able to actually get beyond that hurdle of everybody needs to hear this because it's really important. It is really important, but everybody hearing it won't make it happen. So
I'd like to pick up on your point, Shel, about the supervisors that you're bringing together with these quarterly meetings. And now they've expressed an interest in maintaining those conversations outside of those meetings. So you create the relationship and the interest in the connection, and then that fuels the desire to maintain the connection in that organic way. And I think, it's one of the things we can take away from COVID is that people do want that connection. And with the movement restrictions and people having to, stay at home and work from home and so on, it demonstrated how important those human face-to-face interactions did. The spontaneous conversation when you went to get another cup of coffee because you were struggling with an issue, and then you ran into Russell and you said, oh, this is what I'm working on. Then Russell says, oh, well, have you thought about this? You've got that little moment there where communication has happened. How do we build on that and maintain it? I've started rewatching Ted Lasso, and there's this scene where the CEO comes into the locker room and she addresses the kit man, Nathan, by name. And he just stops and he says, my name. Is that now perhaps in a 1,000-member employee company, you may not be able to have that same personal relationship, but how do you create those opportunities for connections so that people are receptive to either sharing things that they know and feel that you should act on, or that you have information and you want them to, work in a safer manner or pay attention to the complaints process or understand, when people send out disinformation, how you can challenge that so the correct information is provided, etc. So I think that there are the need to have conversations, I think, is paramount, and not just, as we alluded to earlier, being really good, letter carriers and saying, here we are distributing chunks of, quality content. So you're a great content distributor. Yay for you. But what did we do with that? Did you achieve? And, when I say to people, how do you know that worked? It's a big question. Like, how do you know what you know is probably very meta in some cases, but, it does force you to think, how are we successful? And how can we say we're successful when we haven't actually set the target? We're just so focused on making sure everyone gets, a nice newsletter in an envelope, or however it is that we distribute it, a cool looking e-letter in their email box.
what we're really talking about is building trust. I mean, having the right conversations with the right people in the room at the right time. And I agree. I think that's core to what we do.
Ginger, you mentioned before we started the discussion that you're thinking a lot about transitions these days. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about purpose, and I don't mean, the big grandiose purpose, because I think a lot of times we can get so hung up on that. What is my purpose? But about using purpose as a verb, being purposeful in our work. And we actually have gone through with a few people and pulled together purpose maps. How do I bring together what's important to me in my personal life, in my professional life, in my relationships, in my community, and created a filter for what work we want to take on, or how we want to focus our work. If what work is being dictated to you, how can you approach it in a more purposeful way? Because I do feel for myself, we were talking about a transition happening. I thought I would do what I was currently doing until I was 80. But I'm just finding a shift in my focus and a shift in my interest, and trying to figure out, how to be more of a catalyst for good. We talk about that a lot, but how can I make sure that every piece of my work is that way? So have really been focused on creating this filter. I actually took a class with the Modern Elders Academy, and I love their definition of an elder. And it is a person who is as curious as they are wise. So they have an online class. They do in person, but if anybody wants to check out their online course, I recommend it. But it's been making a big difference in how I approach daily work and what I'm willing to take on as I figure out, what's the end game here.
Russell, do you have a philosophy that guides your work?
Not specifically. I agree with everything that Ginger has said about the value of purposefulness, and I think that's important. And I think none of us should do work that we are either uncomfortable with from an ethical point of view, or unskilled to do from a professional point of view. And I suppose that probably is my basic philosophy. But beyond that, no, not really. I happen to really enjoy the work that I do. I've been really fortunate in all the work that I've taken on, wherever I've been, the organizations I've worked with. I think it's 14 different organizations over my career. All of them have been nice, good organizations I've really enjoyed. Currently, where I am at the moment, I love trains. I've always loved trains. I do diesel and electric more than steam, just for interest's sake. But beyond that, no, I wouldn't say I've got a heavy philosophy about how I do things. But I think probably, like many of us, like most of us even, I know when I'm not comfortable doing something, and certainly have reached a point in my career where if I am not comfortable doing it, I have the ability to do something about that.
I'll cast my vote for train travel as well. I find train travel very romantic. So absolutely a romance to train travel. Let's talk about change, because Ginger, you said your practice deals a lot with change. I've been at this long enough to realize that, and I hate to throw a cliche out there that is bandied about way too much, but change is the only constant. We're always going through change. What do you think is the most important part of preparing people for change before it happens?
Listening to them and understanding their needs, which I think goes directly back to audience segmentation that Russell was talking about. I think it's the most critical step in the process, is to completely understand the audience, their hesitation, their resistance, what their needs are, what's important, their priorities. I think I think it's critical to have that before you even start the process of change, because then you're going to be able to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah, Russell, do you deal with change management in your position?
Yeah, I mean, I would use better the term change leadership rather than change management. But yes, I think we've touched on a number of the concepts today. We've touched on advocates and badvocates. Too much change approach doesn't recognize the fact that most people who have been through change have a response to change that is completely different from the way the management expects the change to respond. And it's our responsibility to point out that the way in which the management or where whoever is driving the change thinks it will land, almost certainly that's not how it will land. And we know that the vast majority of change either is unsuccessful or is changed by the time it reaches any point of change. And I've seen that again and again and again. And it's partly because the way in which we go forward with projects like change necessarily has an optimism bias. I think when a board of management, however you want to define that, sits around the table and agrees a change program, they will agree from an optimistic point of view that it will be absolutely it'll go from the here to the there. It'll be a straight line. And we know it's never a straight line. We know that change sometimes goes backwards. We know that sometimes it goes off the rails. In fact, most of the time it goes off the rails. And it's our responsibility, as I say, I think, as practitioners, to add some reality to the situation, to understand where the people who will negate change lie, and also to remind the audience, whoever the audience will be, that in most change, the vast majority of stuff, or certainly the majority of stuff, does not change. So part of it is actually reminding what is constant and what remains, because it's the human nature. It's the old psyche, it's the old cliche. Only a soiled baby wants change, and I think that's the way we are all built. So reminding people what is constant as well as what changes is an important part of that.
Yeah, Martha, do you have a thought there?
Well, I'm always reminded of when I was pregnant and went to labor and delivery classes, and the instructor talked about the period of transition that was going to be very intense. But of course, there was always the payoff that, you'd be able to take home, a baby. And so I often like to focus on change about, what's going to be the benefit, what's going to be the positive, how will things be better? Because the focus is always on this change is happening and it's going to be worse for me. And so I think it's important to understand how change affects people differently, and why today may be the best thing since, sliced bread, and tomorrow it's just going to be, not good at all. Managing change, and I think leading change, which is a great way to look at it, because if you're managing, you're just kind of moving things around on a table. Whereas if you're leading change, you have purpose, you have a destination, you have a direction that you want to go to. And maybe that direction is not going to be linear, as Russell said. Maybe there's a train that went off the rails and now you have to go on this different set of tracks. And yes, you're going to go through a different part than what you expected, but ultimately you're still going to the same destination. And how you communicate that and listening to people's fears, because if the pandemic taught us anything, is that we have a lot of fears, we have a lot of anxiety. Uncertainty is always going to, make things rather hard to listen and to process. So how do you address the uncertainty part of change positively while also recognizing what the risks are? Because in your experience, Ginger, there were people who got to stay and people who had to go. Mm-hmm. Right? So how do you manage that process in a way that leads people to follow and to embrace what you're doing, as opposed to either just saying, okay, I'll go along with it, or I want a package, or I'm just going to be really unhappy and kick up a ruckus, or I'm going to sit outside Ginger's office and wait until she shows up so she can listen to me. Because sometimes that's what people want, is the ear to say, I'm struggling with this, and to be heard.
Right. And we have about 2 minutes left. So Russell and Ginger, I'd like each of you concisely to share your best piece of advice to somebody who is new to the communication profession. Ginger?
Ooh. Well, I wish I'd had time to ponder that one, Shel. My best piece of advice to somebody new. Well, it's an exciting field. It's an ever-changing field. It will expose you to views and subjects, which is part of the fun of it. But at the core, if you incorporate your values and the ethics, because that drives everything we do, you can't go wrong. If you continue to listen, the answer will always be there. I think that's true even with my clients today. They always have the answer. I just need to make sure I'm listening hard.
Great. And Russell?
I'd say never stay where you put. Network ferociously, listen intently, and make sure that you know that ultimately the person who is most responsible for pursuing your career as a communications practitioner is you. And so be curious, listen well, and most of all, make sure that you act with kindness and that you act with grace in the way that I described earlier, because that's important as well.
Well, thank you. I do want to let everyone know that the next Circle of Fellows will be on Thursday, July 20th. This will be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The change in time is to accommodate the participation of Adrian Cropley from Australia. Also joining us will be Sue Human and Robin McCasland to talk about artificial intelligence and how to stay ahead of the curve as a communicator. Also want to take a moment to thank Anna Willie for her outstanding work behind the scenes in doing all of the planning for these episodes. I just show up and moderate. It makes my life easy. Russell, Ginger, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, and welcome to the fellows. And Martha, thank you for stepping in for Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And see
Thank
you all
you.
next month.